When HOA President Karen declared James's driveway community property, she used lies, forged documents, and intimidation to back her scheme. But James fought back with hidden camera footage that exposed her abuse of power. The courtroom showdown was intense, and justice delivered a shocking verdict. You won't believe how James turned the tables and reclaimed his rights. James Parker's mornings usually began with a quiet routine, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the golden sunlight filtering through the tall oaks framing his driveway, and the crisp rustle of leaves underfoot as he stepped outside. But this particular morning was anything but ordinary. As he opened his front door, a jarring splash of yellow caught his eye. At the edge of his driveway, a glaring sign stood tall and unapologetic. Community parking, HOA approved. For a moment, James froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The driveway, which had been part of his home for over 30 years, was now suddenly declared open to everyone? A chill ran down his spine. He walked closer, squinting at the sign as if it might somehow clarify this absurdity. No, he wasn't imagining it. There it was, in bold letters, mocking him. Frustration boiled inside him as he returned to his house and picked up the phone. The HOA office answered on the second ring, and the syrupy voice of Karen Delacroix, the HOA president, greeted him. "James, how lovely to hear from you. What can I do for you today?" Karen's tone was disarmingly cheerful, but James wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Karen, there's a sign in my driveway claiming it's community parking. What's going on?" "Oh yes, James," Karen replied, her voice laced with condescension. "The board voted unanimously to designate your driveway for community use. We've had complaints about the lack of parking, and this was the most logical solution. It benefits everyone." James's grip on the phone tightened. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just decide to take it." There was a pause, followed by Karen's smooth, practiced reply. "James, you might want to check the HOA charter. It's all perfectly legal. We're simply working in the best interest of the neighborhood." Her words felt like a slap. Before James could respond, Karen added with a smug finality, "If you have any concerns, feel free to bring them to the next HOA meeting. Have a wonderful day." The line went dead, leaving James standing in his kitchen, the quiet hum of his appliances amplifying his rising anger. That evening, the situation escalated. James returned home after running errands to find his driveway already filled with cars, 2 SUVs and a small sedan, all parked haphazardly, blocking access to his garage. One car even had its bumper hanging over his lawn, crushing the neatly trimmed grass he'd worked so hard to maintain. James felt his chest tighten as he surveyed the scene. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an invasion. His driveway, once a private sanctuary, had become a chaotic mess. He stood there for a moment, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire building inside him. With a deep breath, he resolved to take action. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. James sat at his dining table, the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the faint scent of his half-finished coffee grounding him as he pored over the old, slightly yellowed pages of his property deed. The intricate legal language felt like a maze, but James was determined to find his way through it. With every line he read, his confidence grew. There it was in black and white. His driveway was explicitly listed as private property, completely outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of clarity sinking in. This was his proof. That evening, James attended the HOA meeting, the usual mundane chatter about landscaping and trash pickup, replaced by a palpable tension as neighbors gathered, drawn by the growing parking debacle. The room, bathed in cold, fluorescent light, buzzed with conversation. As James entered, clutching his folder of documents, heads turned. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside. "Karen," he began, locking eyes with the smug president seated at the head of the table. "I've reviewed my property deed, and it clearly states that my driveway is private property, not subject to HOA jurisdiction. You had no right to designate it as community parking." The room fell silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and a stifled cough from the back. James unfolded the deed and held it up, his hand trembling slightly, not with fear, but with determination. "Explain this, Karen. Karen's reaction was instantaneous, her practiced smile morphing into a condescending smirk. "James," she said, her tone dripping with mock patience, "that document is outdated. The HOA annexed your driveway years ago. Surely you've read the updates." James felt the chill of her words ripple through him. Updates? He hadn't received anything of the sort. The calmness with which she dismissed his evidence was almost more infuriating than her initial actions. "Show me the proof, then," James demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Where are these so-called updates?" Karen leaned back in her chair, her demeanor unbothered. "I'll need time to locate the records," she said, her tone casual, as if the matter was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I assure you, everything was handled properly." The tension in the room thickened as murmurs spread among the neighbors. James scanned the faces of those present, hoping for some sign of support, but most avoided his gaze, clearly uncomfortable. It was infuriating. How could they stand by and let this happen? By the time James returned home that evening, his frustration had reached a boiling point. But the sight that greeted him in his driveway tipped him over the edge. 4 cars were crammed into the space, one parked diagonally, its bumper grazing the edge of his lawn. An oil spill glistened under the streetlights, a dark stain spreading across the pavement he'd worked so hard to maintain. The noise from his backyard caught his attention next, a cacophony of laughter, music, and clinking bottles. James stepped around the side of his house and froze. A group of strangers had set up a makeshift party, using his backyard as if it were a public park. His patio furniture was occupied, his lawn strewn with plastic cups and wrappers. James clenched his fists, the sight of his once peaceful home now a chaotic mess, igniting a fire inside him. This wasn't just about his driveway anymore. It was about his dignity, his rights, and his home. He took a deep breath, the cool night air doing little to calm his racing thoughts. If Karen thought she could intimidate him into submission, she was sorely mistaken. James turned back toward his house, a plan already forming in his mind. This was far from over. James sat in his dimly lit living room, the quiet hum of a small security camera nestled in the corner of his window, blending into the silence. He had spent the entire afternoon setting it up, meticulously ensuring it captured every inch of his driveway. The camera wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a lifeline, a way to take back some semblance of control over the chaos Karen had unleashed. The first few days yielded nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual parade of cars pulling into his driveway, leaving behind oil stains and occasionally crushed flower beds. But then, on the 5th day, something happened that made James sit up in his chair. Karen herself appeared on the footage, clipboard in hand, confidently directing a group of residents. Her voice was clear, dripping with authority. "Don't worry, I've got James under control," she said with a smug grin. The sight of her gesturing toward his driveway as if it were public property sent a wave of indignation through James. That night, he pored over the recordings, replaying the footage to ensure he hadn't missed anything. Each replay only fueled his frustration. Karen wasn't just overstepping her bounds. She was flaunting it, reveling in her misuse of power. The next day, James decided to dig deeper. He visited his neighbor, Tom Willis, an older man who had always seemed uneasy about the HOA's decisions. Over a cup of tea on Tom's porch, James cautiously broached the subject. "Tom, have you noticed anything strange about how Karen's been running things lately?" Tom hesitated, his eyes darting toward the street, as if he feared someone might overhear. Finally, he sighed and leaned in closer. "James, she came to me a few weeks ago with a petition. Said it was just a formality, something about maintaining community standards. She pressured me to sign it, said it was in everyone's best interest. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm not so sure." James felt his stomach drop. "Do you remember what the petition was for?" Tom nodded slowly. "She mentioned something about your driveway, but I didn't think she meant this." It was worse than James had imagined. Not only was Karen directing residents to use his property, but she had also falsified community support to back her actions. Armed with this revelation and the damning footage from his camera, James felt a spark of determination reignite within him. That evening, he contacted a local attorney, explaining the situation and sharing the evidence he'd gathered. The lawyer's reaction was immediate. "This is serious, James. If what you're telling me holds up, she's in clear violation of multiple property and HOA laws. Let's prepare to take this to the next level." James hung up the phone with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just a bit. Karen might have thought she was untouchable, but she had underestimated him. As he sat back and looked out at his driveway, still cluttered with cars, James smiled faintly. The battle was far from over, but he finally had the tools to fight back. The courthouse was a stark contrast to the chaos James had endured in recent weeks. Its tall columns and polished floors seemed to radiate an air of authority and order, the kind James desperately needed. As he sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer Rebecca Lang shuffled through the evidence with calm confidence. Across the room sat Karen Delacroix, her usual smug demeanor intact, though there was a faint tightness in her smile. The proceedings began, and Rebecca wasted no time presenting their case. With every piece of evidence she laid out, the cracks in Karen's facade began to show. First, the hidden camera footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video played on the overhead screen, clearly showing Karen directing residents to park in James's driveway. Her words echoed through the room. "Don't worry, I've got James under control." A murmur spread among the observers, and Karen's expression shifted to something far less confident. James watched as her carefully constructed image of authority started to crumble under the weight of undeniable proof. Rebecca then presented the petition Karen had used to justify her actions. The signatures were real, but the context was fabricated. One by one, residents like Tom Willis testified, explaining how Karen had pressured them into signing without fully disclosing the document's purpose. Tom's voice trembled slightly as he recounted the encounter. "She made it sound like a routine matter. I never realized it was about taking James's property." Karen's lawyer tried to counter, arguing procedural technicalities, but Rebecca was prepared. She highlighted glaring inconsistencies in the HOA's records, pointing out that no formal vote had ever been conducted. She even unearthed emails showing Karen had acted independently, bypassing the HOA board entirely. The turning point came when the judge, a stern but fair man with an air of no-nonsense authority, addressed Karen directly. "To Miss Delacroix, the evidence presented today paints a clear picture. You've not only overstepped your authority, but have actively manipulated your position for personal gain. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Karen hesitated, her usual bravado nowhere to be found. I was only trying to address the community's needs," she stammered. The judge raised an eyebrow. "By falsifying documents and coercing residents? That's not addressing needs. That's a violation of trust and the law." As the judge delivered the verdict, James felt a wave of relief wash over him. The court declared his driveway indisputably private property, outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Karen and the HOA were ordered to pay damages for the stress and inconvenience they had caused, as well as covering all legal fees and the cost of cleaning the driveway. Karen's confident demeanor had completely crumbled by the end of the hearing. She sat stiffly as the judge listed the consequences, her once unshakable authority reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. As James walked out of the courthouse that day, the crisp autumn air felt like a victory in itself. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now approached him with nods of support, and even a few apologies. Justice had been served, and James had not only reclaimed his property, but also reminded everyone that no one is above accountability. For the first time in weeks, James returned to a driveway free of clutter, the evening sun casting a warm glow on the clean pavement. As he stood there, breathing in the peaceful silence, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. News of the court's verdict swept through Glenwood Estates like a gust of fresh air, carrying with it whispers of justice, finally served. Residents who had once whispered about Karen Delacroix in tones of admiration now spoke her name with a mixture of disbelief and scorn. The woman who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist was now a symbol of what unchecked power could lead to. By the end of the week, Karen had tendered her resignation. Her confident facade was gone, leaving behind a figure diminished by the weight of her own actions. James, though relieved by the outcome, found little satisfaction in Karen's downfall. Watching someone lose their standing, even someone who had wronged him, wasn't the kind of victory he'd hoped for. But the sense of peace that returned to his home was undeniable. For the first time in weeks, his driveway was clear, his backyard silent save for the gentle rustling of leaves. Still, James understood the importance of this moment, not just for himself but for the entire neighborhood. The fight he had waged wasn't just about his driveway, it was about accountability, about showing that no one, not even someone in power, was above doing what was right. To mark the occasion, James decided to host a community barbecue. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs wafted through the crisp autumn air, drawing neighbors to his backyard, now cleaned and restored to its former tranquility. The tension that had once hung heavy over Glenwood Estates seemed to lift as laughter and conversation filled the space. James stood by the grill, flipping patties and greeting each neighbor with a warm smile. Many approached him to express their gratitude. "You stood up for all of us," said Tom Willis, handing James a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I wish I'd spoken up sooner, but I'm glad you didn't back down." Others echoed similar sentiments, sharing their own frustrations with Karen's leadership. Some admitted they had feared speaking out, worried about retaliation. The event became more than just a celebration. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that the neighborhood could be stronger when people stood together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, James took a moment to reflect. He leaned against the fence, watching as the last rays of light cast a warm glow over his driveway, a space that had once been a battleground but now stood as a symbol of perseverance. He felt a small, satisfied smile spread across his face. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a triumph for fairness, for the belief that persistence and truth could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The residents of Glenwood Estates had learned an important lesson, and James hoped they would carry it forward. Standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, could inspire change and create a better community for everyone.